Welcome to our symposium. Thank you very much for joining us. Our team seeks to review the concept of equity against the educational cases in Hong Kong. I am Dr. CHOI Tae-Hee, who is working at the Education University of Hong Kong. And as a chair, I'll provide a brief overview of the symposium. Following the lead of intergovernmental organizations such as the UNESCO, educational equity has become a buzzword for educational policy and practice. The meaning of equity, however, is more assumed than explicated. Even when it is explicitly discussed, its practice is subject to interpretation and implementation by policy actors. The symposium, contributed by scholars based in the Education University of Hong Kong and their collaborators, analyzes how educational equity is conceptualized at different levels of the educational system, from early childhood to higher education, either in official policy or through practice. It also explores how different stakeholders have worked on addressing inequity and how stereotypes hinder educators and leaders to enhance equity. The first paper by Dr. YUEN and Dr. Gallagher opens this symposium, drawing attention to how educational spaces are rarely given due attention, but play a crucial role in causing disparities and inequity, in particular in Hong Kong kindergartens. Jang then moves to secondary schooling and debunks the model minority stereotype and deficit-oriented narratives in the United States through employing the framework of critical quantitative intersectionality. Dr. Tang then leads us to ponder about the impact of academic entrepreneurialism in higher education, critically reviewing the institutional policies and professional activities of knowledge exchange. His paper explores the equity impact of higher education for attaining social justice. Paper 4 by Dr. Young broadens the scope of discussion beyond the traditional space. He discusses students' perceptions of whether and how out-of-school private tutoring or shadow education contributes to the existing inequity in mainstream education. Finally, Dr. BRYANT and Dr. GUBE reconfirm the important role of senior management in shaping the equity landscape within an institute. While situated within a secondary school setting, the strategies they report will resonate with leadership in any educational sector. This timely symposium collectively points at the need to contest the narrow conceptualization of equity in terms of academic achievement, emphasizes the need to challenge the given knowledge about equity, and asks us to reconsider the complexity involved around equity. It thus contributes to the ongoing debate on educational inequity in the academia and educational policies. Finally, the symposium sets a firm ground to the sequel parallel conference to be held in the Education University of Hong Kong in 2021. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. YUEN and Dr. Gallagher, who will present the first talk of our symposium.
Let me introduce the problem to you first when we start talking about the key findings of our study. So the main problem of our investigation was kindergarten spaces in Hong Kong are pretty much not meeting the policy goal of promoting children's holistic well-being. And these spaces are oftentimes limited in size and characterized by spatial practices privileging static desk-based tasks over active play, physical movement, and multisensory experiences. So the study actually was a mixed method study supported by the Public Policy Research Funding Scheme under the Policy Innovation and Coordination Office of the Hong Kong SAR government. The main goal was to produce a systematic understanding of the space issue, including the spaces and spatial practices of kindergartens participating in the kindergarten education scheme implemented in 2017. So today's presentation will focus on some of the key survey findings. First of all, classroom space. Regarding this, we found a greater proportion of long whole day kindergartens rated items as inadequate to severely inadequate. And these items included space for furniture, space for activity corners, space for various kinds of activity like free choice, sensory exploration, and small group discussions, and then space for children's storage and exhibition. During the ANOVA test, it showed a significant difference in particular activity corners between operation mode and mainly with long whole day kindergartens reporting a more serious lack of space for arranging activity corners. Coming to spaces for free play and physical activity, we were particularly interested in examining space for free play because it's a new curriculum expectation required by the kindergarten education scheme. Under the spatial constraints of kindergartens, we were also concerned about children's physical development on the premise. Let me go to free play first. Around half of the kindergartens in each operation mode reported free play as the most difficult daily activity for spatial arrangement. The ANOVA test indicated a significant difference between operation modes on the adequacy of space for free play, with mixed mode and long whole day kindergartens experiencing more inadequacy than half-day kindergartens. So what about physical activity? Many kindergartens actually reported having inadequate space for various forms of physical activity. The ANOVA test showed significant differences between operation modes in adequacy of space for ball games, running, and challenging activities, like in terms of height, speed, and level of difficulty. Again, long whole day kindergartens reporting the inadequacy of space as most serious. I'm moving on to spaces outside of kindergarten premises. We examined spaces both within and outside of kindergarten premises. We wanted to find out about the surrounding environment, which might affect kindergarten's access to public spaces and community facilities to address the space issues on the premise. So the results, the top 4 frequently reported challenges in using public spaces and community facilities were, number 1, safety concern that might include security issue, street crossing, objects throwing from above, because that's pretty much about the public housing estates situation. And then adult child ratio issue, that means we have to have by law a certain ratio between adult and children to go outside. So that's again resource implication. The third most challenging reported problem was the need to apply for use each time for the public spaces or community facilities. This means single application without the certainty to get the space. So kindergartens can't actually have the space for daily or regular activities because it's all subject to the result of each application. The last or the fourth one was no priority is given to kindergartens in the applications. That means kindergartens have to compete with everyone else for the space they want, and without any priority, also uncertainty. So it makes it totally difficult for kindergartens to plan for regular exercises with children outdoor, or to use the space for larger events like parent-student events. So chi-square test actually didn't show any significant differences between operation modes on all these items, and also others that we didn't cover today. That means the problems were pretty commonly shared by kindergartens. The last key finding is about environmental problems. So the most frequently reported problem was mosquito infestation, followed by rat infestation, sounding pretty scary. Noise, traffic emission, sewage problem, poor air circulation, and also inadequate light within the premise and also outdoor. And chi-square tests again revealed no significant differences between operation modes. So like the one before, kindergartens had similar problems. So the frequently reported challenges and environmental problems have serious implications for kindergartens' access to public spaces and community facilities to address the space issue on the premise.
So just to summarize then, in terms of the kind of key messages from this piece of research, the first thing to say is that many of the kindergartens reported problems with spatial provision across a range of different areas. So there were problems with classroom spaces, problems with space for physical activity and free play, and lots of problems with outdoor space. So as Gail's just said, there was a sense that really all of these kindergartens were experiencing some kinds of problems, and in some cases it was the majority of kindergartens that were experiencing problems. So there are problems across the whole sector. Okay, that's the kind of first key thing that we found. The second is that the majority of kindergartens augment their spatial provision because they've got problems with the spaces in their premises. They augment that provision by using spaces outside their premises, like public parks and podiums and community halls and so on, for certain activities, as Gail's explained. But as Gail said, using those additional spaces then creates its own problems. And Gail's just run through some of the issues, those issues to do with children's safety in those additional spaces, to do with adult-child ratios and problems with access. So it's not straightforward for kindergartens to get access to spaces that are off their own premises. What that then means is that these spatial problems that kindergartens are experiencing are intertwined with spatial problems in the wider urban environment. The problems that are in the city end up being problems for kindergartens as well, because they can't provide their children with everything they need within their premises. They have to go outside. And so then if there are environmental problems, those problems end up being problems for the kindergartens as well. We can see these problems in a historical context of Hong Kong's development, in which kindergartens have always been assigned a marginal position within planning. Kindergarten planning has always been subsumed within public housing and within private developments, compared to schools that have had reserved sites. So there are constraints then within the physical design of housing developments and the wider environment of those residential developments. And again, kindergartens end up at the mercy of those limitations and problems. Another key finding, as Gail has shown us there, is that there are numerous statistically significant spatial disparities between Hong Kong kindergartens. And these are particularly pronounced between operation modes, with the burden of many reported problems falling most heavily on the long whole day institutions. So all kindergartens have spatial problems, but those problems are unequally distributed, and the long whole day kindergartens seem to have the most acute problems, and it's in many cases statistically significant relationships there. So it's worth noting then that the long whole day kindergartens also have a different history to the other modes. They were originally under the jurisdiction of welfare rather than education. So there's a kind of historical dimension, we think, playing out in what we can see within the survey data. The long whole day kindergartens also tend to be used by families from lower socioeconomic groups. And so if you think about the potential impacts of these kind of spatial problems on children's learning and development, you know, having inadequate space for physical activity, having inadequate space, as in terms of the kindergarten's own view of it, our space, you know, them saying to us, our space is not adequate or has problems when it comes to these kind of activities. There's cause for concern then that those kind of problems and those disparities between the different operation modes might be creating forms of educational and developmental disadvantage that compound the wider socioeconomic disparities, because you've got the sector that's most used by families from lower socioeconomic groups also having the most acute problems across the sector.
Thank you, Gail and Mike, for your wonderful talk, which raised our awareness of the often disregarded impact educational space can have on students' learning and development. Our third talk will be delivered by Dr. Tang.
Hello, everyone. The title of my paper is Considering Social Justice in the Rise of Academic Entrepreneurialism, the Equity Impacts of University Knowledge Exchange. So the aim of my paper is to examine the engagement patterns of KE knowledge exchange using the cases of Hong Kong's public universities. Especially, the paper wants to examine the extent to which there's a tendency of convergence or divergence of the institutional practices of KE engagement. And the second purpose of this paper is to review the institutional policies and how those policies affect the professorial activities in relation to KE knowledge exchange, especially how these dynamics enable or endanger the equity impacts of higher education for the purpose of attaining social justice. So the context of this paper is the rise of entrepreneurialism, and we conceptualize it as the entrepreneurial turn from traditional academy to the kind of so-called entrepreneurial universities. By entrepreneurial turn, it means the mission and function of universities have been changed from the past, which focuses on creating and teaching knowledge for the academic world. But now entrepreneurial universities want to do this with the perspectives of social and economic benefits to solve problems in the real world. So what is added to the two traditional university missions, which are teaching and research? Now we have the third mission, which is KE knowledge exchange. So despite that kind of entrepreneurial nature of KE activities, recent academic literature also suggests the need of differentiating knowledge transfer or technology transfer, which are mostly commercial, which is about commercialization of academic results and knowledge, but to differentiate it from this to knowledge social engagement, which is for the benefit of the community. Because the knowledge social engagement does not have the function of commercial profits generation. So I want to argue there's a two-phased nature, Janice-phased nature of university third mission of KE. And this provokes diverse responses and tensions among academic profession, which ranges from enthusiasm to skepticism on whether recognizing KE as scholarly endeavor or whether academics want to prioritize KE as one of their professorial tasks alongside research and teaching. And university, with their own distinctive institutional history and developmental pathway, differentiate themselves from others with respect to their strategic responses to increasing demands of KE, usually top-down. And there are a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities surrounding academia. However, little is known about the pattern of KE engagement by academics who are affiliated with many different types of universities. So this paper uses the conceptual theme called institutional logics to review the relationship of institutional types, university institutional types, academic responses, and the patterns of KE engagement. So by institutional logic, it is considered as shared rationalization, which offer cognitive and practical templates to university for fulfilling their everyday tasks. And I developed a typology of university for analyzing KE engagement. And this is a 2x2 typology. with regards to dimension. The number one dimension for this university typology is on mission orientation, whether the university focuses on teaching or on research. And the second dimension is the scope of academic disciplines mixed, whether the scope is comprehensive or large, or the scope is very specialized, like specializing on education or specializing on science and technology. So these two dimensions makes this specific typology I want to use for the purpose of analyzing patterns of KE engagement. Because on the rationale that centrality of KE is affected by the role of disciplines, whether the institution highlights disciplinary transitions or is innovative and entrepreneurial for mixing and focusing on interdisciplinary projects. And the second point for the centrality of KE is on the rationale of knowledge creation, whether it is purely intellectual or is a little bit more innovative, and I understand is as more entrepreneurial, or whether it's a mix of intellectual rationale and entrepreneurial rationale. So on this slide, you can see that 2x2 table for the 4 types of university. And the thinking behind that typology is the rationales and resources for knowledge creation. There are 2 main points underpinning the thinking behind this typology. The first rationale is, to a certain extent, specialized institutions embrace more entrepreneurial rationales for knowledge creation by synergy of interdisciplinary initiatives and interdisciplinary innovations. And the second rationale is for mission orientation. Mission orientation affects research intensity and also the resources a university receives, and then to allocate them for KE in relation to research and teaching. So to conclude this paper, we observed that since 2009, when the Hong Kong government launched the rather top-down KE policies and deliver resources for KE activities, Hong Kong public universities have commonly accumulated experiences from institutionalizing KE and also for building up their capacity. And increasingly over more than 10 years, they encompass a more diverse framework for KE in response to that kind of top-down policy and resources input. But we find that that's not totally a convergence pattern. Rather, we can find that the academic and institutional responses to KE appear more dynamic and diverse, despite there are many convergent trends of institutional practices in higher education, say research performance. So what we find is that Hong Kong public universities, with their own distinctive institutional history, they are endowed with very unique positioning and missions in the larger socio-economic developments of Hong Kong. And there are specific institutional logic which provide cognitive and practical templates to the universities for fulfilling the organizational goals and formulating institutional policies for KE engagement. And we find that KE activities are rather multidimensional, and it involves very different degrees of direct or indirect engagement in the public and private aspects of KE. And that reflects very diverse types of academic values and different academics upholding different academic values, ranging from traditional academics, civic active and engaging academics, entrepreneurial academics, to some group of academics, they rather want to become academic entrepreneurs. So the last implication for this paper is the limitation of a singular successful entrepreneurial KE model. And higher education leadership should understand the heterogeneity and institutional characteristics of local universities and innovate the diverse types of KE between academia, society, and economy, because this understanding is especially important for universities to enhance its equity impact and fulfill its public vision in the current age of global injustices and unprecedented crisis. So thank you. This is the end of this paper presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Tang, for delivering this very timely talk in the context where knowledge transfer and impact of research are increasingly emphasized. Now we will move to the next speaker of Dr. Yang, who will discuss educational equity outside of schools.
The topic of my presentation is about whether shadow education exacerbates educational inequality. And I look at this issue from the perceptions of secondary school students in Hong Kong. So at the beginning, what do we mean by shadow education? Actually, in the literature, it is a metaphor for private supplementary tutoring. For private supplementary tutoring, we have a definition for that in the literature. So basically, there are three components. The first one is privateness. That means it is a service that is in exchange for a fee. The other one is supplementation, okay? That is, it supplements the provision of schools and is provided outside school hours. And the third component is academic subjects. In the literature for shadow education, we focus mainly on those subjects that are featured in the official mainstream curriculum as well as the public examinations. So why do we have the metaphor of shadow education? So private tutoring only exists because the mainstream exists. As the size and shape of the mainstream changes, so does that of the shadow. So in Hong Kong, shadow education is widely known in Cantonese as 補習, which literally means to supplement, either for remedial purpose or for enhancement. And you can see from the slide that private tutoring in Hong Kong is so popular, okay, according to the research done in the past 2 decades. Actually, it's not just Hong Kong or Asia. I would say private tutoring has been on the rise, okay, all over the world because of our increasing needs for performance in academic subjects. So what does the literature say about shadow education and its roles in exacerbating educational inequality? Actually, there are actually two sides. Okay, some researchers have been focusing on the negative side of shadow education, showing that it exacerbates social stratification and also inequality, mainly because higher income households are able to afford the tuition fee, while those who may not be able to afford the tuition fee will be disadvantaged because they are lacking the extra learning opportunities to learn outside schools. However, there are also research showing that rich families already have had those educational advantages, and shadow education is not really playing a very major role in exacerbating the educational inequality. I myself have also done research on that, and I published a paper about a narrative case of a student who borrowed money from her relatives to attend private tutoring. And she commented that actually shadow education expanded her social network with students from prestigious schools with a hope to ultimately gaining the economic capital for escaping poverty. So we can see from the literature there are two sides, okay, in this argument. So for this presentation, the research question is, how do secondary school students perceive the relationship between private tutoring and educational inequality? As for the methodology, this presentation is actually part of a larger study with a range of methods, as you can see on the slide. But this paper, okay, mainly focuses on the data from semi-structured interviews. So the participants were 18 secondary 6 students who enrolled in English private tutoring. And then they narrated their experiences and also reflected on the role of private tutoring on educational inequality. So what are the major findings? Some students, okay, said it did exacerbate educational inequality, mainly because those who can afford it had fewer opportunities to learn. You can see from the quote here on the slide. And also, okay, they may lack extra support outside schools. This is a very interesting quote. I think I lost at the starting line. People attending tutorial classes are like driving a car and you can only walk, right? So it shows a very big contrast, okay? Because students who can afford the tuition fee can really learn very fast. However, there are also arguments from students saying that well, it may not exacerbate educational inequality, mainly because private tutoring is not really a necessity. So you can see that, like from a quote, some students who cannot afford it can actually join some after-school remedial classes offered by the school. And they can also gain peer support. For example, they can ask for their peers who enrolled in private tutoring to share the notes with them. But, you know, of course, I mean, the peers need to be generous enough to lend the materials for those who are not able to afford the tuition fee. But according to my participants, okay, generally, I mean, the peers are pretty supportive. And then I asked the participants to reflect from a more macro perspective, to take a more critical perspective on analyzing why, okay, it is the case that shadow education may or may not, okay, exacerbate educational inequality. And quite a lot of them mentioned the education system is to blame, mainly because of the education system that requires performativity, requires a lot of like examination results. And sometimes the examinations may not be really testing the student's ability per se, but the skills of taking the exam. The other reason is the marketization of education. And, you know, students have actually noticed that the advertisements are everywhere, that if they actually have a feeling that if they are not enrolled in private tutoring, they will be disadvantaged. Finally, okay, some students also mentioned the lack of government support. Well, yes, I mean, the government has been providing quite a lot of resources or support for their learning in mainstream education. But talking about like out-of-class learning, students are saying that, well, there's a lack of resources for that. And this means that those poor students, underprivileged students are mainly provided with the basic needs. What if they need extra help? Then they may not have enough resources. So coming to the discussion and implications part, to ask the question, does shadow education exacerbate educational inequality? I think the main question, the main answer for this question is depending on whether private tutoring is perceived as a necessity. To analyze this from the Bronfenbrenner's ecological system theory, okay, which I find pretty appropriate, okay, from the findings, that there are different levels that we can interpret what the students perceive. The first one is the individual level, all right? It is important that we understand whether the students themselves are high or low in self-efficacy. If they believe themselves that they can do it, if they can achieve high academic performance without the help from the tutors, they may not really need private tutoring. Of course, at the same time, it also depends on the students' motivation and also their self-regulated learning capacity. Because if they are self-regulated or if they have self-motivation, then they will be able to find a lot of ways to learn by themselves without really needing private tutors. From the microsystem perspective, of course, it also depends on the school teachers' quality. If the school teachers are teaching already very well, they may not really think that they need tutors outside school. And of course, it also depends on their peer support as well as the family support, see whether they have that kind of environment provided for them for their own learning. For the macro systems, of course, I mean, we need to think about the role of the education system. If the education system continues to focus too much on examinations, which require students to use test-taking strategies, and if the schools are not actually dealing with that enough, then naturally the students may go for private tutoring. And also we have to evaluate whether the culture of marketization of education is taking place. Then in this case, from a policy perspective, we may need to regulate, okay, how advertisements are out there. Okay, we may also need to like regulate what information is provided on the tutorial advertisements. So actually, there are a lot of issues that we can think about, okay, from the perspective of private tutoring on educational inequality. Yeah. So these are some of the references. I hope you find these references useful. If you have any questions, you can email me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yang, for enlightening us on how education outside of school worlds have a close interrelationship with educational equity within schools. Now we will have the final talk of our symposium by Dr. Darren BRYANT and Dr. GUBE.
This study emerges from a research project that we conducted looking at how multicultural education was enacted in different schools. And one of the surprises that we found in this particular school was that it had a very elaborate kind of school infrastructure that was designed to support their rather diverse student body in this enactment of multicultural education. So that's essentially what we're looking at in this study.
I think that our key entry point to this was that we were looking at global education, you know, how teachers understood and implemented global education. But then when we went to the school, it gave us a very different picture of things. But rather, I'm just going to stick to a few core claims of global education, and one of which is how global education curriculum is shaped in ways or implemented in ways to connect with the students' lives, right? And that involves more explicitly recognizing and validating students' cultural identities, regardless of where they come from. Now, locally in Hong Kong, global education is implemented through liberal studies. The theme on globalization has a focus on human condition and contemporary world. So that's very broad, which also leaves a space for teachers to interpret the curriculum or that theme particularly in very different ways.
So as we engaged with our informants, we found out that the school had to find a particular infrastructure in order to support dealing with these kinds of issues. And so when we look back at the literature on school leadership and organization, we find that more and more leaders have a role in designing the infrastructure of their schools. And Spillane defines this as being the roles, so the people and the teams who make things happen, routines that they, regular norms and activities that they engage in. The tools could be instruments, could be things like curricula that they utilize in order to make a change in their school, and certain practices that they engage in. So aligning these infrastructure or these elements of infrastructure in a certain way can support the accomplishment of school goals. And so we found this is exactly what was being done in the school. So we'll start with our findings. We had really three major findings looking at this sort of enactment of global education and support of diverse students in the schools. And so one is diversity was defined very, very broadly in this school, far beyond the curriculum. Second, it actually involved a kind of layers, if you will, or almost like an onion of unfolding communities. So there was the school community, the district or the neighborhood, and then the broader societal community of Hong Kong. And so these infrastructure were employed differently to address these. And in the figure that you'll see here, we've tried to depict what this infrastructure looks like. So on the one hand, there's a typical academic structure going from the principal through the academics, the vice principal, subject heads, teachers, students. On the other side, there was a specialized structure that was created just to meet the needs of diversity in the school. And all of these people interacted with each other, as we represent by the cycle in the middle. And then the output of this interaction was engagement with these different stakeholders and the different layers of community that you see on the right.
So now we want to situate that infrastructure within the broader context of the school and even the society of Hong Kong. Because in Hong Kong, when we talk about ethnic minorities, we're typically referring to people of Indian heritage, Pakistani, Filipinos, Nepalese, and so forth. So these non-Chinese population comprises of 8% of the total population based on our latest statistics that we have in Hong Kong. And currently there are about some nearly 33,000 of ethnic minority students in Hong Kong. And what we found in this school is somewhat reflective of the broader situation in Hong Kong when we talk about cultural diversity. And Darren and I sort of put it together and describe it as what we call cloistered multiculturalism, which means in Hong Kong, there is multiculturalism, but they only occur in very specific spots of the society. So in this case study school that we went to, about half of the teachers of the school were ethnic minorities. So predominantly, they come from an Islamic background. And interestingly, in that school, they offer different language subjects. Like in Hong Kong, typically we offer Chinese and English language subjects. But in this school, we found that they have Urdu, Nepalese, or even Arabic subjects. Right? And interestingly, I think that my last point here is really connected to what Darren was talking about, which is putting some of the teachers in leadership position. So moving to one of our key findings in the ways in which global education is broadly conceived. It is broad in the sense that because the school has a very explicit mission about being culturally harmonious. So what we found, I think the most tangible, diversity element in this school is when we were asked to observe, to visit their cultural carnival there. And when we asked the teacher why we were asked to observe this event, and the teachers told us flat out, right away, well, because you're looking for global education, and this is a fitting event. This is the best occasion for our school that represents global education.
So thinking about then these different sense of community that the school employed, this table tries to show a sense of how this infrastructure was aligned. Actually, the next two tables will show that. So first we see our different communities. We see the different roles of stakeholders in these communities. And you'll see that as we go through the different layers of community, additional roles are given attention to. And each of these communities had certain needs that that the school tried to address. So I've just highlighted a few examples because there's too much detail to go through if we take it all individually. So if we're looking at the school need, the school recognized that its families were geographically spread throughout Hong Kong. They tended to be poorer ethnic minority groups. It's very hard to get them to all come to the school to meet teachers and do this kind of thing. So instead, the school took an outward mobility structure and actually used its community relations department to go out to different wide-ranging communities in Hong Kong to talk to parents, inform them about what their children were doing and how they were doing and how the families could engage with the school. At the district level, we saw, again, the community relations department and the civic education department working together with community members and families and NGOs to address the issue of students' sense of belongingness to the community. And so Jan already gave an example of how they did this. But what was interesting is this was a two-way street. There was, on the one hand, trying to show that the students themselves, who were ethnic minorities, valued Chinese culture, but also that they could make strong contributions to it. And that was really one of the purposes of the event that Jan mentioned. And then the third level is the broader societal level. And really, this we see enacted at the policy level, where people like the principal and again, the head of the community relations department worked on two-way advocacy. So for example, they would invite the police services into the school to run like a cadet youth training club for students. But also they would advocate to the police that, look, you need our students to join the police force so that they can serve communities that are broader than just the local Chinese community. So they actually were very, very strong in advocating both for their students, to the community, and also in the other direction. And we also saw this in work on curriculum advising. And then this last slide of findings looks again at the elements of this infrastructure and their alignment, going from our different communities, the roles that were engaged in the school and externally, the different routines that were employed at each level, the tools that were used, and then what this meant for interactions. So for example, using these different elements of infrastructure meant that the community relations department was able to model leadership to students and model community engagement to students. We had mentoring by leaders in the community relations department to teachers, and the interactions around outreach. And we saw this at all the three different levels. And so employing this infrastructure slightly differently to engage different levels of community.
So one of our findings, as mentioned, was about diversity being broadly conceived beyond the curriculum. So here we found that the significance of being able to redefine school-based initiatives or even curriculum based on student needs. I think we found even much more specific examples of these where teachers were, when they taught, liberal studies or global education, they were making specific reference to students' heritage background. That's one. And the second one, which is about the broader community aspect of it, it's not what we observed, that the school was very proactive in responding to the public attitude around diversity. And I think particularly trying to engage the local Chinese community, helping them to understand ethnic minority. And the second aspect is supporting diversity in the three levels. We do find that the distinct feature of it has to do with its unique sociocultural background of the schools, which in many ways have driven the proactive engagement, within these three communities or levels of infrastructure. So specifically, when we're talking about engagement, it really requires a specialized infrastructure. It's not just talking about, okay, we have diversity, we have this mission statement, but we really need to put people in place who have the knowledge and expertise about the different communities in how we might be able to engage the family and the community and students in a more proactive way.
Thank you both for opening our eyes to the important role of actors networked and embedded in the infrastructure of the community on educational equity in schools. Did you enjoy our symposium? We would like to end the symposium with these three questions for reflection. First, in your society, how is inequity or equity conceptualized in your field of education? Second, does the conceptualization contribute to reproducing the existing social inequity? If so, how? Finally, what actions can we take to improve educational equity in that regard? We hope our symposium provided an opportunity for like-minded people to join forces to increase educational equity. Finally, I would like to extend a warm invitation on behalf of the Department of Education Policy and Leadership and the Education Policy Research Hub of the Education University of Hong Kong, who will host the CHOI conference next year. See you in Hong Kong. Thank you very much.